we have been carried along by the God who has kept us from the monster. And now we have the escape. We are in a horror film. We are in a horror film where we are the monster. And we've been offered an escape. How could we not take it? So if you have any fear of the unknown, fear the God who's made himself known.
Well, hello and welcome to Stir&Fry. I am joined by a very special guest today, Nick Whitaker. How do we know each other?
Yeah, I am an American, and I just started working at Speak Life with you and everybody else at Speak Life, and it's been phenomenal. So yeah, I just recently moved out here and sort of dove into things, and so here we are. This is the first bit of public content that we're producing.
Wow, there we go.
This is the genesis.
And so today we're going to be talking about can Christians watch horror films, and this has been a conversation I've been meaning to have for a while actually, so I'm glad I can do it with someone as passionate about it as you are and as passionate about the Bible as you are, because I feel like horror is a bit of a tricky topic, isn't it? I don't know if you find that. I was speaking to a friend a while back and I asked him, what film did you go to see? And he said, I saw A Quiet Place. And I was like, cool, I've heard that's a really good horror film. And he was like, I wouldn't have called it a horror film. And that intrigued me because I feel like it definitely is rooted in the horror genre.
Yeah.
But it's almost like he was cautious to use that term. And I found that among both Christians and non-Christians, actually, that there's this kind of suspicion of the horror genre. And so if a horror film's popular, we don't even want to use that term because we don't want to be associated with films like Saw and The Human Centipede and stuff.
Right.
So have you found that? And if so, why do you think
that is? People a lot of the time want to slant horror films into the thriller genre really quickly. Whereas the emotions are pretty distinct. I haven't ever watched a thriller and then left feeling like, I'm thrilled. No, I was mostly horrified and terrified for what was going to happen. Horror films also, it's such a large genre that to say horror films, you could be evoking something as universally beloved and recognized as a good film like The Shining or The Thing. Or you could be lumping everything you're watching in with films that are universally hated, such as The Human Centipede or Saw. So it's a dangerous label just for that reason. It's dangerous by association.
Right, interesting. Yeah, no, those are some really good examples. Jaws might be another example. Yeah. People are like, it's not a horror film. It's they're very quick to deny it. And it might not necessarily scare you witless, but it's still in that kind of genre, isn't it? And even if you don't like those, there will be films you enjoy that have a horror element. Harry Potter, Lord of the Rings, Wallace and Gromit and the Curse of the Were-Rabbit. That terrified me as a kid. The bit when Wallace transforms into this rabbit. I mean, it's horrifying. Yeah. And it's very much drawing influences from horror films.
And even, you brought to mind for me, the show I was terrified of as a child was the show House, the doctor show. Just because of that moment where everything is going wrong medically, there's something terrifying about that moment that you're afraid to watch because it affects you viscerally. It's, especially when you're younger, I think a lot more things are horror though.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of horror fans have said that actually the things that have scared them most have been kind of children's TV shows and stuff, weirdly. There was an episode of Pingu, about the little penguin, where it's being chased by a walrus, and it's terrifying. I've never seen anything so scary. Yeah. So it's weird that, and Doctor Who is a family show, but that has had some really scary things in it. So it is broader than we think. It's more widespread than we think. And I think the horror genre itself is kind of a monster that society doesn't want to confront.
You really brought it full circle there. That was intense.
So what is a horror film? If we do have to kind of put a label on this, like, what is the horror genre in terms of fiction and storytelling in general?
Yeah, I think it's the key question, because like we said earlier, if you say the word horror, no matter what your definition of horror is, the person you're saying it to might think, oh, some of my favorite movies fall into that category. I absolutely love Hereditary. I absolutely love American Psycho. I absolutely love, some of the most iconic films, not just in the horror genre, but in general. Somebody would say, I absolutely love Alien.
Yeah.
Or somebody will hear you say, oh, I watched a horror film, and they go, oh, you like movies like Leprechaun, like Pinocchio? Yes, those are real horror films. You like those movies where people's bodies are getting chopped up? So even if we define it well, we run that risk of, having to deal with people's misconceptions of it. But nonetheless, I think it's important to define it according to how we're, treating it as people who are watching it as film and not just as, well, something's on, so it might as well be there. How are we really defining horror? And I think you said it best. We were talking earlier, and you said it's a film that produces an atmosphere of dread, of a fear about what's about to happen. I thought that was tremendous.
Oh, shit. Well, yeah, I guess I've been trying to wrestle with it for a while. It's more than tension, isn't it? Because a thriller could have a lot of tension in it. It's a specific type of tension, a suspense that something horrific is going to happen. If it kind of sustains that, I think it's a horror film. And so horror films kind of provoke fear in the audience, and it's interesting that horror films and comedy films, what they have in common is that they both evoke quite a visceral response.
Yeah.
It's quite obvious if they're working. If you walk into a good comedy film in the cinema, you'll see people laughing. If you walk into a good horror film, you'll see people, hiding their eyes or screaming or...
And ironically, the reverse is true. If you walk into a bad comedy film, you see people hiding their eyes and going away from it. If you walk into a bad horror film, you'll see people laughing.
Yeah, which can sometimes be it's entertaining to watch the terrible horror film sometimes. I'm gonna get deep now, Nick, I'm afraid.
I like that you let me know before you did. You said, here's a warning.
Yeah. What is fear?
I think there's a few different ways that different people would approach the question, and I'm going to roundabout to the way that I would approach the question. I think a few people would approach it from a biological perspective, that fear is an evolutionary trait from which we derive our very survival. That fear is essentially our hormonal adrenaline response to something bad is going to happen. I don't want it to happen. I'm going to respond accordingly. Fair enough if they want to make that. That's not bad. Some people would describe fear in heavily romantic terms, in terms of, well, we fear that which can hurt us. We fear that which has hurt us before, that we don't want to be hurt by again. We fear that which is difficult to understand as a person. And so that's not a bad definition either. And both of those can work in horror films. But I think fear on the most, I want to say, metaphysical level. Us in the universe, what is fear? Fear is the way by which we deal with the unknown that can affect us. We have a general idea of what is not known about the universe, a general idea of where our knowledge starts to end. And beyond that doesn't fear us, but we do fear what's locked inside of the closet. Right. That's a very small unknown, but that unknown affects us infinitesimally more than does the mysteries of the cosmos and the stars millions of light years away. We fear what we don't know, but can affect us.
So it's kind of local, in a sense, close to home. Right, yeah, that's really interesting. And I suppose we were talking about this the other day, but what does it mean to fear God? Because I suppose God is seen by many people as an unknown. Yeah. And even though we believe in God, we believe that we know God and we have a relationship with God, there is still a lot of unknown. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could press into that a little bit. Yeah, well, see, this is where it becomes just so interesting. Because we could just say it's unknown, but then again, we also fear a bear, and we know what a bear is. And when a bear is running at you, you feel fear, even if you know exactly what a bear is. So it's not exclusively unknown. There's a sense in which those things that can hurt us, even when we know them, we know they can affect us. We know we have a regard for our own survivability. So those three definitions mixed actually find their ultimate point
when we're thinking about the fear of the Lord. Now, there's a few different definitions of the fear of the Lord, and people have tried to sort of define this, and what we find most of the time is if you were to go into a church now and you were to ask, well, what is the fear of God? In my Bible, I was reading it, and it said that I need to fear the Lord. How do I do that? I shouldn't be scared of God, right? And people will go, oh, no. Whenever you see the word fear, that just means respect.
Right.
That just means like a big reverence. That's really what that means. And so when you read about Ezekiel falling down and fearing the Lord that he was going to die, it really just means he respected the Lord so much that he wanted to throw up and die. And then when you read it like that, it doesn't sound right. If you were to take other portions where really anytime anybody meets God and they have this fear of him, they don't respect God so much that they want to fall down and die. They're afraid. The ancients, both the Hebrews and the Greeks, had a conception of fear, and the same fear that we have. In that, though, theologians worlds better than me have done a brilliant job of categorizing different types of fear. My favorite, and you could go through so many different definitions, from Calvin's different definition of the filial fear, and then the reverential fear, and the different kinds of things that go on there. John Murray does a great job in a book called Principles of Conduct of doing this, but my favorite quote is by John Murray on this. And this is where I think the fear of God finds its highest point, because he battles between the problem of knowing that fear really is, if God wanted to, he could absolutely obliterate me. Mm-hmm. This is terrifying. I have no conception for this, and it very much can affect me. And at the same time, it's a familial fear, or how Calvin says a filial fear, where it's not unknown, but is made very known to us. And so God has made known his power to us, and yet still we say, I can't do anything before you but bow and give my all to you. So one fear would pull us away and one fear would pull us close. But the way he draws this out is perhaps, I think, the best groundwork for any horror film. He says this is the fear of God working in man, that he is at all times aware where he is in relationship to God. He's continually asking the question, where am I and where is God? Now I'm paraphrasing there. He wrote that in a book called Principles of Conduct. I think it's later in the book. I'm not going to make an exact reference, but understanding that actually gives you the basis for really how you would understand the most basic horror films. Where's our hero? Where's what he fears? That's really the main question of any horror film. How far am I between what is the distance between me and the danger?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm watching, actually experiencing genuine fear, and watching a horror film is quite a good approximation to that, I think. Is that teaching us something about our relationship with God?
In some way, I think it can. One of the most famous verses about fear is Proverbs 1:7. I'm going to make sure here, but it is, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So what is the beginning of wisdom? And most people would run from there to say, well, you have to define wisdom. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. Fools despise wisdom and instruction. That's Proverbs 1:7. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of these things. And so when you're looking at a horror film, and really it's the question we're tackling is can we watch horror films? I think this question falls under, would a horror film be beneficial? Could it give us some intuition into what the fear of the Lord is? It heavily depends on the film. But understanding how fear works can absolutely show us how we need to fear our God. For instance, if you watch the movie Paranormal Activity, right, this is a phenomenal film for what it was, and you go home from that film and you're a Christian and you start to say, well, no, I'm just terrified of demons. I'm going to set up a camera. I'm going to make sure I can track them through the house. I'm going to go through all of these things. You have learned the exact wrong lesson that you need to learn when a Christian watches a horror film. Right. When you look at the book of Daniel, I think this is one of the most key things. A lot of people want to take Daniel 6 with him in the lion's den and say, well, Daniel just trusted the Lord so much. He just trusted God and it worked out. And in fact, the word trust is used. He said, look, Daniel trusts his God, and his Lord is favorable to him. But the mistake most people make is they think that Daniel 6 ends with him leaving the lion's den, and then there's just 6 more chapters of prophecies. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. All prophecies. But when you look at the dates of those prophecies that are written in, you realize his whole life has been spent prophesying. And then he gets thrown into the lion's den. Now in Daniel 7, this famous prophetic image of what's going on in the end times, when the world is over, you get this picture of Daniel, who is not just sitting there saying, wow, don't I just trust and respect God so much? His words are this: as for me, Daniel, my spirit within me was anxious, and the visions of my head alarmed me. I approached one of those who stood there and asked him the truth concerning all this. So he told me and made known to me the interpretation of these things. Fear of the unknown that can affect us. He repeats in there, he says, I didn't sleep for days. I was beyond fear. And so when you present him with this idea that, hey, if you don't stop worshiping God, we're going to throw you to the lions. The question isn't, did Daniel trust God? The question is, who does Daniel fear more? The lions or the Lord?
Wow.
And when you think of it in that way, then you can begin to understand why Daniel would do something so irrational, and why the fear that he experienced in interacting with God informed the way he interacts with things that we should be afraid of. So a Christian, watching something like Paranormal Activity, can reverse engineer that whole equation. You don't have to leave a movie like Paranormal Activity and say, wow, don't I fear demons? You can leave it and say, wow, well, that was a great bit of entertainment, but the only person I'm afraid of is God.
Wow. That's really helpful, actually. Yeah. And I just had a look, and some studies have shown that actually watching horror films is quite good for the human body, which is interesting. Which isn't a reason in itself to watch them. But it's certainly intriguing that it seems counterintuitive that fear, it's almost like we're designed to experience fear. And it's very different to feeling stress. You know, we feel stress a lot. And that's kind of, the serotonin, and you just feel kind of, But, when you actually experience fear, and I don't think we experience it very much nowadays. So I'm very privileged that I haven't been in many situations where I've experienced proper fear.
Yeah.
But watching horror films, I think I do experience some of what it's like, and it's this kind of cold sweat. It's really alert. It's almost a heightening of living. Yeah. Which is a really weird thing.
I think it's good for us on multiple levels. You mentioned earlier how comedy and horror are so similar, that the responses are so visceral. There was a book called Making Movies Work by something Borston. I can't remember. I think it was Richard Borston. And he wrote that there are 3 general ways that movies work. It's visceral, vicarious, and voyeuristic. So the way a film would work voyeuristically is if you're watching it happen on the screen, and the enjoyment is yours, but you're watching the experience happen to other people. A vicarious response to a film, or the way that would work, is where you're experiencing something through one character. You're feeling it through them and out the other side. Now, a visceral response to a film is it's happening to you. And what better way to identify yourself with the stories you're living in than to have a visceral response? Not that vicarious and voyeuristic can't be good, but you're right in that there are very few things that really pull us in like that and have an effect on something like our bodies.
Yeah. Our
bodies are affected by the movie we watch. That's what a work to be done with a horror film.
Yeah.
That really, it's rare for another genre to do that.
That's so true. Yeah. Cool. So that's kind of the actual process of watching a horror film, the fear that it induces. So if we move on now to kind of the actual subject matter. First of all, is there anything in Scripture that outright forbids us from watching horror films? I mean, horror films have only existed about 100 years, so they're not going to be talked about in the Bible, but is there any inkling that we can't engage with this kind of popular culture?
Yeah. Let me put myself into the mind of somebody who would say we can't watch horror films. Because, spoiler, I like them enough that obviously I go and watch them.
This isn't really going to be a debate. We're quite
we pretty much agree on this entirely. if I were to put myself into the mind of somebody who had said, no, I don't think Christians should watch horror films, some of the places I would go immediately are to say, well, you can go to Philippians. Think about what is excellent, what is good, whatever is holy. Think about those things. You don't have to prove to anybody that what happens in most horror films isn't excellent and pure and holy and good. You don't have to prove that that's, and I don't think anybody should try to prove that actually, no, this is holy.
Right. Yeah.
No, it's sort of a lost cause in that regard. But the exclusivity of thought isn't what Paul is saying in Philippians. You could go to a few other places that Christians would say, we have to engage with censorship here. And really, if you're saying we can't watch it, that is censorship. And I'm not saying that in a political, anti-free speech way. Yeah. But there is a statement you're making when you say morally a Christian should have a problem when they see something that's terrifying on screen. If that's your approach to that, I would just love to go through a week in your shoes and see what you actually can engage with. If you can't engage with anything that isn't Scripture, that you can only think about this thing, and you can't engage with things that make you cry, laugh, and be afraid, then I don't know. But no, to your question, I don't think there's anything in Scripture that explicitly says you cannot watch this.
If we were to read the Bible from cover to cover,
yeah,
it's all a bed of roses, right? It's all nice stories.
All of it is very, very nice. Nothing bad ever happens in all of Scripture. Yeah. Now is there genuine horror in the Bible? Could you call it horror? Yeah. The first time the word fear comes up in the Bible is in Genesis, when the Lord is describing the ways that the animals will react to the humans. The dread of them shall be upon you.
Wow.
The first experiencers of fear, at least literally, I'm sure Adam and Eve experienced a great deal of fear when they hid after eating the fruit, but the dread of you shall be upon them. You could make an argument that depending on how it was shot, if you made a movie of Cain and Abel, that could be a horror movie as well. Mm. Abel's out Abel goes to meet Cain in the field, and Cain murders him in cold blood. We don't even have to go to the places that are notorious for fear and violence to see that in Scripture. The problem is I think people often associate horror and violence. Now, we shouldn't love violence. So, if we're looking for in Scripture, it's like, is there anything explicit that says you can't watch it? Well, it's like some movies, you should not go and watch explicit, horrible violence for some enjoyment of that.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a sense in which it's comparable to pornography in terms of violence. It's like we don't glorify and enjoy that. Yeah. But understanding that fear plays a very real part in very real stories means that if we're really going to understand the Bible, we need to be willing to look at it as people who are vulnerable, who can be hurt, and who can be victims of being afraid. It's a part of who we are.
That's really helpful. Yeah. So it's a kind of yes, but, isn't it?
Yes. It's always yes, but, or no, but. There's always a little room.
Yeah, it's this kind of, can we engage in popular culture in this weird, Jesus-y way, where we're not fully running with everything that goes, but at the same time we're not just doing the opposite and shielding and say, I'm not going to expose myself to any of this stuff.
I mean, a lot of Christians would have a lot of problems with horror films. I don't want to say a lot, but some Christians that have problems with horror films yet openly advocate for a movie like The Passion of the Christ.
Sure.
Yeah. That movie's more violent than, I would say, most horror movies.
Yeah. And I think there are some rom-coms on a completely different note.
Yeah.
Whose morals are more horrific than a lot of horror films, which is interesting.
It's not so much the films we watch and understand that they're fake that can be harmful to us. It's the ones that we watch and we believe, well, that could be real.
Right.
That exists in my world. That can really dig in and actually change the way we think about things that are important.
Yeah. That's almost more insidious in a way, isn't it?
Another good horror film.
Ah, there we go. Yeah. Yeah. So I suppose if we go to the extreme, and the ones we were talking about that probably wouldn't be appropriate for a Christian to watch, things like The Human Centipede, Saw, Martyrs. I don't know if you've heard of Martyrs.
No, I've heard of it. Yeah.
So I haven't seen any of those, and I don't really have any intention.
No intention of seeing them either. Yeah.
Yeah. But I wonder if even something like that, it does point to Jesus in some strange way, in that it's so twisted that you can't help but imagine what it's like untwisted, as it were. And it's kind of like the book of Judges, that as you're wading through the depravity and just the lowest of the low, like this is what humanity can get to. The best moments in the book of Judges are when it ends, because you're like, thank goodness we're out of that. And also when God shows up in those incredibly powerful moments. Now, of course, Saw doesn't have a moment where God shows up, but I wonder if you were to see it, if you had the misfortune of seeing it, you would leave it with a longing of, well, there's got to be something.
There's got to be something, yeah. There's a few. I've developed a habit for myself, especially with horror films I don't want to watch. I just go on Wikipedia and look up the plot. Now, people might be infuriated with that decision, but you can't watch every film, and some films I just don't want to watch. And so when you look up Saw, I can see, okay, well, I don't want to watch the plot of this. So instead of showing me this horribly graphic scene, I can read a sentence. It's just like, and then this girl died. And that's that scene. So you can get something of that, of like, oh, what's the message of Saw, without going through it. But unavoidably, there are Christians who have seen Saw, and some of those Christians might have learned something from that film. Really, I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
But it's a tough question, I think, of in the most depraved films, can we still see that we're in God's world?
Wow.
Yeah.
I reckon if you spent too much time in them, probably not.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, I think, why the Philippians thing is helpful, is getting this kind of balance in. If you listen to a depressing podcast on repeat, you're probably going to start to have a depressing outlook on life. And it's not to say that we should fill our lives with, well, obviously, scripture, which has a range of things and is really honest about the deep emotions. It's not to say that the films we should watch should all be jolly and happy and everything. But it is maybe getting that balance of, actually just, spending time with people and finding the good things in life rather than gravitating towards these kind of horrific things all the time.
We have to live inside the world we're living in. We can't create a world within and say, well, this is the world I want to live in instead. We live here. What I find tremendous in that, tremendous in thinking through this process, is not so much saying, what am I allowed to do? Because we know how we work. Whatever we're allowed to do is rarely what determines what we actually do. It's not as if you have to say, oh, I can never watch that kind of film. Obviously, don't watch it if you don't want to watch it. But to pay attention to the patterns that you're creating in your watching of films. That's where I think horror, as well as comedy or romance, can form some very deadly patterns of sin. Where if we're not paying attention to, well, maybe I shouldn't be watching death and murder and violence in every film I watch every week or every day. That could do some damage. Yeah. For
sure. Yeah. So it's not just whether a particular film is suitable, but it's kind of the environment within which you're watching it and the films that you're watching alongside it. It's okay for a story to have bad things in. I mean, if stories couldn't have bad things in, then, the Bible will have ended in the Garden of Gethsemane, right? Yeah. So bad things can happen in stories. That's not the problem.
Yeah.
So let's say there's a story in which a monster abducts a woman. That's a bad thing, right?
Poltergeist. There we go.
And but there are two ways that a film director could approach that kind of subject. They could tell it from the woman's perspective. And so we empathise with her as the victim. We fear what she fears. We fear the monster. And that's good. That's the way it should be. The alternative, and this is, I think, horror at its worst, is when you're put in the shoes of the monster. And therefore, the monster and her victimization is glorified.
Wow.
And so I think it's all about kind of who it's told from, the angle that the story is taking. So it's not so much the subject matter itself, but the filmmaker's perspective on it. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it absolutely makes sense. Recently, we were just talking about Joker. That was a very controversial film for, I think, partly that reason, where people were saying, well, are you glorifying the things that he's doing by having him be the focus of the film? Whereas centering a film on the villain of an iconic superhero is bound to do that. It's bound to make you empathize with the person you're following until you realize you're following a monster. And so it's a question of, and I loved Joker, by the way, but it's such a crucial question. Who is this film about? Is it about evil in its purest form being shown for what it is and being defeated? Or is it about evil thriving in some mystery world that doesn't really exist, where we're glorifying it instead of watching it be defeated? Yeah.
Yeah, and I also think of Jesus on the cross, obviously. You've got the spear stuck in his side. That's told from the point of view of Jesus. My God, why have you forsaken me?
Yeah.
And so if you're with this guy, if you're with Jesus, you will follow him and live this kind of cross-shaped way of life where you will be on the receiving end of condemnation. But that's kind of the way that Jesus pioneers. Whereas imagine if that story was told from the point of view of the Roman soldier, with the spear, exerting his dominance, then that would completely kind of change the tone of it in some way.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's naturally how we are. We are complicit in the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Because we all reject it.
Well, that's one of the biggest turnarounds in the whole Bible, is one gospel does do the end from the centurion's perspective.
Wow.
As Mark ends, it shifts if it were a film, it shifts to the camera to the centurion who has just killed Jesus. And he says, truly, this man was the Son of God.
Wow.
He has the worst possible moment a character can have in any story, where you've just killed the Son of God, and 5 seconds later you realize, like, that was the Son of God, right, guys? It's like, what a beautiful but horrible moment.
Yeah.
Like, and you realize how much impact that has. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. What about supernatural horror? I think this is a kind of another dimension to it, because the majority of, I might guess, directors who make films like The Conjuring and stuff that explore a lot of ideas rooted in Christianity. So things like demonic possession and exorcism and stuff.
Yeah.
These go right back to the ministry of Jesus, these things. And we believe that demons are real, that angels are real, and obviously God and Satan are real. In the hands of someone who perhaps doesn't actually believe in those things, could that be quite dangerous? Is there a danger they could be very flippant about these things that are actually to be taken more seriously?
I think those movies could only exist if non-Christians made them. I think if a Christian wanted to make a film about demon possession, it would end in 8 seconds. That would be the end of the film. It would be, I think our daughter's possessed with a demon. And then someone would go, no, dummy, Jesus has already won. Take her to the hospital. That would be the end of the film if a Christian with good theology made a film about that. So already when you're starting off with one of those films, the thing I have had in my head is I'm walking into a comedy more than I am a horror movie. Because it's scary for them, but I've lost the vicarious connection with that character, and I've lost the vicarious connection with the story. Because as soon as they're talking about theology, and they created the backwards world where somehow demons are not subject to the King of Kings, then already I know I'm living in a world that's trying to pretend to be the real world. And that, inherently, a lot of these films are saying, okay, well, let's take the base reality we have and say there's this malicious realm beyond it that's going to invade and get us here. Now, I'm not saying demons have no interaction with the world today. It's the whole matter of spiritual warfare. But to say that we're going to make a film where we're going to have a series of things happen that clearly will not happen, as Christ has already won the victory over the grave and constantly protects everyone, then what do I have to gain by watching that film in terms of my understanding of of theology? Not much. What do I have to gain in terms of entertainment? Depends on whether the movie's good or not.
Sure.
So, as Christians, I feel like those sort of turn into parodies for us, where we sort of say, well, yeah, but that's not how it would really happen. Or the non-Christian would say, like, wait, you believe this stuff really happens? And you go, well, yeah, but it happened a lot differently when Jesus went around. So we have sort of a weird interaction where those films are made for non-Christians, other people in that world to say, well, maybe there are demons. But when Christians react to them, they go, well, there are, but they're not like that. And they are, but they're also defeated. They also believe in God. You know, nobody holds up a Bible at a demon. And, you know, it's like, this Bible was printed in Indiana in 2012. Back, you. It's like, what? So we have just a different perspective when we watch them. But I think the entertainment value of them is totally on the merit of the film itself. Sure. For instance, you know, the first Paranormal Activity, unbelievably good film. Right. When I watched it, I wasn't a Christian, terrified. I watched every other Paranormal Activity after I became a Christian. And they were fun to watch. But it really just because they weren't as good. That's really where it landed. They weren't as good.
That's interesting. So in a way, if anyone has to watch those sorts of films, it should be Christians, because we're not actually going to be perturbed by the sorts of things.
It stays fantasy for us in terms of, you know, like, well, that's not how it happened.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah, because I actually had a conversation after Hereditary with a non-Christian friend, and he said he's a very staunch atheist, you know, has a very naturalistic worldview. And I said to him, he was just talking, and he was saying, oh, I'd never do a seance or, you know, something like that, where you're kind of trying to connect with a spirit or the dead or something. And I was like, oh, that's it. I'm glad you said that. I think we should absolutely not dabble in those sorts of things. But if you just believe that those aren't real, then why are you even scared to do something like that? I don't think he couldn't really answer. I think it's interesting talking to people that they do actually have a slight fear of these sorts of things,
right?
Even if they don't believe in them,
right?
It's like I watched Candyman the other day, the new sequel, and it's this whole thing that if you say Candyman into a mirror 5 times, he'll appear and stab you in the back or something. And loads of people are like, I would never say Candyman 5 times before a mirror. And it's just interesting, isn't it? It's partly a testament to the power of the storytelling that it rattles you so much. It
rattles you in that way. And a lot of these films give a very accessible point of entry that's meant to scare you. So it's not like, oh, this one guy found this one thing in Antarctica and it haunted him for the rest of his life. Some movies are like that. But when you watch that movie, you're never going to be like, I'm never going to do an archaeological dig in Antarctica. It's like, well, nobody thought you were.
Yeah.
But a lot of these films will start you off with like, well, they just found an old board game. Or they just found a book. And then, lo and behold, everything else happened. And so we had friends growing up that would be like, I'm not playing with a Ouija board or the Ouija board, just because there was that idea that the very normal and tactile could suck you into the supernatural. Even people who weren't believers would be like, I'm not touching that. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. So, but your response would be not that the world needs to be more afraid of those things, but that we need to be more afraid of God.
Right.
And then realise that He is the one who can drive out these kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like, well, if you have any fear of the unknown, fear the unknown that has made Himself known, if you're the God who is unknowable by our knowledge, who's come down into the earth and died, that is the one to fear. Like, what? Like, that is, how could you miss that? Yeah. Hebrews talks about it, says, how shall we escape if we neglect so great a salvation? In some sense, you could say that we are the final girl. Have you heard that horror movie phenomenon where it's like the final girl is the last, is in so many of these horror movies, you know, let's say like a summer camp movie, there's always the last girl that survives and she defeats the monster and escapes. And so there's a phenomenon, I think it's either a book or a movie that just came out called The Final Girl Club, where it's essentially, let's get a group of, like a support group of women. I don't know if it's a support group or just a group of the last surviving victims of horror movies and horror stories. We are really, we have been carried along by the God who has kept us from the monster. And now we have the escape. We are in a horror film. We are in a horror film where we are the monster. And we've been offered an escape. How could we not take it? So if you have any fear of the unknown, fear the God who's made himself known. Like, it couldn't be more clear in my head. However, I might have just explained that in a totally opaque way.
No, I think that's really helpful. I love the idea that, well, it's also horrifying, but it's a very powerful kind of way of talking about films, is that we're in one. We are in a room where the doors have been locked. Yeah. There's no way out. We're going to die. And then yet there is the man who has stepped into creation. Right.
And that's the, gosh, I don't know if we're heading that direction, but that's the gold of horror movies, isn't it? Wow. The one single solitary moment where the whole plot flips and it's like they escaped or they killed it or it's over. Like, oh, that is relief. Yeah. You don't get that in any other genre.
I'll tell you one horror film that really disappointed me was Krampus.
I did not see it.
Did you not see it?
No, but I know what it's about.
It's an interesting counterpoint to this, because it's about this kind of evil Santa Claus called Krampus, who's the opposite of Santa Claus. He brings gifts that are sharp and attack you and stuff. Sorry to spoil it. If you just mute the next 10 seconds if you don't want it spoiled. But the main character, the young boy who ended up bringing Krampus to the house, he summoned him. At the end of the film, this young boy realizes his mistake and says, "Don't take my family, take me instead." And it's this great Jesus-y moment. He's laying down his life for his family. He's taking responsibility, although in this case it is actually his fault. But nonetheless, he's taking responsibility for the situation, and he's going to make the sacrifice. And then the enemies just laugh, and it doesn't work. And then the whole family ends up trapped in a little snow globe, among many others in this kind of Krampus verse.
Krampus verse. Watch out, Marvel Cinematic Universe. Krampus verse is on its way.
But it's just so disappointing, because it's like it laughs at the Jesus card, and we're now at the point where we laugh at that.
You could say the same thing with Hereditary as well, which is my favorite horror movie. It does really laugh at that concept of rebirth. Again, you're going to have to mute the next 30 seconds if you haven't seen Hereditary. You need to see Hereditary if you haven't, though. It's a great movie. The end, where essentially you have the spirit of this young girl being put into the main character, the young man, I forget his name, and in the end of the film, he's in the treehouse and he does the mouth noise. He goes, and that's the end of the film, where he's died as one person. He's being reborn as this king of the demons, Payman. So you watch that film and you're thinking, well, this is a film about resurrection. Even the song behind that, which is so famous, is called Reborn. So the main character is reborn, but it's not reborn into something that escapes from the old pain of life. It's reborn underneath. It's reborn into condemnation. And so it is possible to have stories that can be bad, like Krampus, where you're like, well, wait a minute, that's just, why? Or you can have stories that are good that ultimately don't give us the sort of redemptive allegory we really wish we could always have. Yeah,
and by the way, I don't think all horror films should have happy endings, for sure. Like, I mean, The Thing, it's kind of, well, there's some guys that make it, but it's a pretty bleak situation.
Yeah.
Alien.
Midsummer, another one.
Yeah,
where,
love it.
Yeah, it's not all of them. And most horror movies are notorious for doing that, where they sort of make you unhappy, and then they do it to themselves. Even with the most successful horror movies, they might have it end well, and then they'll say, here's a sequel. Actually, everything they did didn't matter. Yeah. And more people are going to get killed now. So horror movies are notorious for that, where it's like, we really can't be married to a happy ending. Yeah.
And in a way, if it is the unhappy ending, if the evil does win the day, it does leave you with a longing of well, there's got to be.
There's got to be
who
more,
could
please.
overcome this.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, on that note, so you've mentioned some of your top horror films. Do you have any others?
Yeah, I think in terms of the most impactful horror movie that really made me start to enjoy horror movies had to be, well, I remember the first movie I was scared in ever, genuinely scared, and I watched the whole thing. It was Alien versus Predator. So I was young when I watched that movie. I think I must have been 11 or 12, in that range. And to be able to watch that and think like, oh my gosh, this is properly terrifying. At the time, that was what it was. I think as I've watched more movies, I'm like, well, I don't know that I'd even call it that. But my favorites, yes, I think Ari Aster's a genius. Hereditary and Midsommar are definitely up there. Although I'd consider them maybe one film, just because they're such companions with the whole light, dark, king, queen thing. They're really good. I always recommend The Babadook to people, which I think is a phenomenal horror movie. I really love the classics. But gosh, I'm trying to think of something maybe less stereotypical that I've embraced as a horror film. But nothing's currently coming to mind, so I think I'm going to have to pass that same question to you, Thomas. What about you?
Oh, yeah. Well, I've had the benefit of being able to write down some things. So sorry, but...
You're at quite the advantage there.
But certainly A Nightmare on Elm Street. Big fan of that. It's kind of a reflection on insomnia in some ways. And that does have a great kind of moment of defeating the threat. But then there are sequels.
Yeah.
Donnie Darko.
Oh, great movie. Yeah. Brilliant. I've never thought of that as a horror movie, but... Yeah,
it's an interesting one. It's certainly... the horror isn't, like, relentless, for sure. But I think definitely, I mean, the bunny, that's pretty scary, isn't it? And it even plays... they go to a cinema in it, and it plays The Evil Dead, Sam Raimi's zombie film.
Yeah.
So it's very much kind of got its foot in that kind of territory. And actually that has a great kind of sacrifice moment when he decides to go under the falling aircraft turbine.
Yeah.
Candyman, the original Candyman for sure. Very interesting film. Great score by Philip Glass. Weirdly, like, beautiful score for a horror film.
Yeah.
And it has this kind of romantic feel. But that's essentially this guy who was this black man who was lynched in, I think, the 1870s. You think he's coming back to haunt people. If you say his name 5 times in front of a mirror, he appears. But really, it's far more subtle than that. It's the pain of what was done to him that has created this kind of incarnation that no one can shake. So it's kind of a reflection on terrible tragedies and terrible evil in the world brings about consequences that last for generations.
Yeah. I just remembered mine. I remembered one, Train to Busan.
Oh my goodness.
Which is a phenomenal film that is just harrowing. Yeah. But you also have sort of the similar, like, Christ figure moment where the main character, lets himself, says, I need to be able to be bit so my daughter can survive and move on. Yeah. And it comes with this promise of new life afterwards. So, but that movie is so gory, but I think I love it for, gosh, they have a lot of cheesy action in it, but it's also just like, as a child of the gaming, era, I just grew up on, zombie violence and stuff like that. So, well, I can't do anything like Saw. Right. The zombie movies have always been the soft spot for me. So Train to Busan tops my list there.
Yeah, and it's a good tip for filmmakers in general. If you want to make a zombie film 5 times scarier, put them on a train.
Oh my gosh.
Because it's so much more claustrophobic.
Yeah, it's...
crawling along the luggage racks and...
Yeah, the way they use that space. I mean, we could talk about that in other movies for hours, but yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sure. Have you seen The Witch?
No, but I actually... So a part of what I was interested in, studied in university, was about primary source documents, and something I thought was fascinating about that movie that I didn't see, because at the time I was like, I already know what it's going to be, was that movie was written completely off of primary source documents. So the whole script was copied from what people wrote in that era about witches.
Yeah.
So it's like 1-to-1. So really what you're getting is not just like, what if this happened? But you're getting like, this is what they were afraid of. Now, whether those things are real really isn't the important question historically. The important question is, this is how they felt. And so to turn that into a film is phenomenal, which is, I don't think I should be so enthusiastic about a film I haven't actually seen. But
Scariest film you've seen, would you say it is Paranormal Activity?
I think at the time, Paranormal Activity scared me to death. I've liked a lot of horror movies, but God, I feel like it's sort of cheating to pick something that I watched when I was so young. I feel like I'd more have to pick something that scared me recently. Just because everything scares you when you're a kid, you know? So you can watch just like, I don't know, some cartoon and it terrifies you. I think the scariest movie I ever watched, at the time of watching it, I think I was very, very scared of Battle Royale, which is the Korean. It's like a thriller action movie, but it's much more like violent than Hunger Games, but it's basically the same thing. But sitting down to watch that was absolutely terrifying because of the way they shot the film. And it's not technically a horror film, but I think I was just the most scared of the way they filmed that and the different characters they have in it. It was a terrifying movie to watch. But I can't really count movies that gross me out as like scary. It's a completely being horrified is very different than being disgusted, I think.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think for me probably the Blair Witch Project. That terrified me because I saw it on a laptop screen, which I think is the best place to see it in a way because it's like you're actually
watching
looking at this
thing.
found footage that you've uncovered, and it's incredible that it was done with such a low budget. I mean, it's literally just camcorders and stuff in the woods, 3 actors. But it's just so effective. Doesn't even have any music in it. And yet, I could barely watch a lot of it.
Yeah. There was a on those scariest things, I think probably even more recently, there's a game that's sort of based off of that style of thing called Phasmophobia.
Wow.
And it's a game where 4 people essentially roll up to a house in a van and they grab all these tools to look for ghosts and they go inside of the house. And it's a very like basic game, but the idea is that at any moment, you know, the ghost could decide to attack, all the doors start opening and closing, lights turn on and off, and it's absolutely terrifying. So it's one of those That's if I had to say the most scared I've been recently is just playing a game where it really puts you into that place. That's a whole other genre to explore too, because horror games have become so much more popular, and it's not hard to understand why. What more terrified could you be than if you are the main character in that situation? Do you have any horror movies that are so bad that you love them?
Oh, that's a great question.
Or maybe ones that you love, everybody else hates, because horror is notorious for like those specific types of movies, which are so bad, but still very beloved. The Cube is one of my... Right. Have you seen that one? It's completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's literally... it's so dumb, but it's such a fun movie for what it is that it's like, okay, I'm in. I'll watch it again. Yeah.
Yeah.
Something like that. But like old movies like, Leprechaun, Pinocchio. I think I mentioned those earlier. There's other dumb ones that, none of them are coming to mind right now. But
oh no, I have. You've just reminded me. Bad Taste. So early Peter Jackson, before he did Lord of the Rings.
Oh gosh.
Did a series of trash movies. Because it's kind of a genre in its own right.
Yeah.
And it just knowingly quite bad. Like, they look like home movies almost. Surprisingly good special effects. I mean, not very realistic, but like, they worked hard on them. Apparently they did the sound effects by like squelching yogurt in their hands and stuff. And it's just ridiculous. I mean, it's a film in which a guy falls off a cliff and his head, like, his skull opens up. And then he just like gets up and then like picks a bit of his brain up, puts it back in, and then he has to like kind of sellotape it shut and stuff. And there are these aliens attacking them, and it knows what it is. It commits, and it's
It just goes for it, yeah.
But I tried watching it with my family, and they were just like, "This is terrible."
Mm.
It's like you would have no idea that this guy would go on to make Lord of the Rings. And in a way, the way the orcs are killed sometimes in quite spectacular ways, you see the roots of that. In these
You see where he came from.
Yeah, so I guess in conclusion, we can watch horror films as followers of Jesus. Maybe not all horror films, in fact, certainly not all horror films, but it's a case-by-case thing. You know what you can handle, you know what will be appropriate and what time and what other things you're watching alongside it. But engaging in them in this weird Jesus-y way, where we don't fully run with them, but we don't fully shield from them, I think could lead to some great conversations with people about Jesus. I mean, a lot of people watch horror films. It's a very popular genre. And I think if we can engage with that, it'd be really cool. Yeah.
You can talk to people about fear, something otherwise it's a hard subject to get into. But to be afraid with your friends, what better way into the gospel?
There we go.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Nick.
It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, thank you for having me.